The crusading movement of the High Middle Ages began as a theological concept. Gregory VII, like other popes during the last half of the 11th century, received appeals from the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople for Western aid against Turkish incursions. It was not difficult for Gregory, nor the clergy that followed him, to come to an understanding that war against the Turks could be not only justified, but understood as an obligation under the tenets of the Christian faith, for the Church was already in the habit of blessing Christian warriors in their struggles against pagan forces. But the appeal to defend Jerusalem carried far more powerful spiritual connotations, since this was the holy city where Christ had walked the earth. The idea of the crusade is not only a just war, executed in self-defense, but also as a pious protection of the physical site of Christ's mission in the world came to define the theology of religious warfare throughout the crusading era. The crusader, then, took on a profound spiritual role in the medieval imagination. He was a fighting pilgrim whose combative functions were accompanied by a pious reverence for the Holy Land. The crucial and seminal expression of Crusade theology came in 1095 at the Council of Clermont, when Pope Urban II delivered a speech before many important figures of the Western European nobility. Urban had received word from Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, ruler of the Byzantine Empire in the East, that his lands were being ravaged by Turkish invasions. Therefore, the Pope called on the nobles of the West to conduct a military expedition to the Holy Land. Urban's invocation profoundly impacted Christian civilization, inspiring warriors from France to Italy, and providing the basis for future crusades. Urban began his speech by arguing that Turkish conquests of Christian cities in the East were a grave injustice. For Urban, the Turks were most certainly unprovoked aggressors, but their crimes were magnified because their victims were followers of Christ. A foreign people, he explained, has invaded the lands of those Eastern Christians, depopulated them by slaughter and plunder and arson, kidnapped some of the Christians and carried them off to their own lands, and put others to a wretched death. Such injustice demanded the intervention of capable Christians. Urban suggested that the warriors of the West were being called by God to aid their Eastern brethren with a defensive retaliation against the Turks, pointing to the military prowess of Frankish and Norman knights as a sign that God had selected them for this task. Secondly, Urban described the spiritual significance of Jerusalem, a place deservedly called holy, in which there is not even a footstep that the body or spirit of the Savior did not render glorious and blessed. The Pope insisted that it was intolerable for non-Christians to be allowed to disrespect this sacred location, both by physically destroying sacred sites and by defiling them with the rituals of their own religion. This argument was easily accepted by Urban's audience, who had heard stories about Islamic abuse of the Holy City since the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim bin Amir Allah ordered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre destroyed in 1009. Again, Urban said that Westerners were spiritually obligated to protect the sacred, which included the city where Christ had walked, as well as the lives of his followers in the district. Having outlined the justifications for war, Urban took this opportunity to denounce private war as mortally sinful, condemning the common 11th century practice of solving personal disputes through combat as a violation of the Fifth Commandment. Urban insisted that martial action in defense of Christian lands against non-Christian aggressors was the only sort of violence that could be considered righteous. The Holy Church, he explained, reserves a soldiery for her to help her people. A knight who acted selflessly, sacrificing time, toil, and perhaps even his life to defend the cause of God, fulfilled a beautiful task in the divine plan and was a dutiful disciple of Christ. Thus did Urban establish the enduring idea that crusading earned remission for sins, explaining that the suffering resulting from the undertaking of a religious war would win a participant immediate entry into heaven upon death. In the 5 years that followed, Urban's theology thoroughly saturated the events of the First Crusade. All of the eyewitness chroniclers who accompanied crusading armies recalled the Pope's notions. 2 of those chroniclers were clergymen, who naturally spoke in similar terms to Urban, but the third was a Norman knight. and it is fascinating to read his expressions, which provide an example of clerical military ideas being absorbed by a member of the warrior class. This anonymous knight said that in the act of taking the cross, the Crusaders were redeemed from the hand of hell. He also was certain that Christ was with him in battle, describing the Lord as something of a warrior king fighting to aid those who had come to liberate the land of his birth. Other warriors wrote with similar enthusiasm about the Pope's ideals. Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond IV of Toulouse, the two dominating figures during the 1099 conquest of Jerusalem, sent a letter to Urban's successor, Pascal II, affirming their belief that sufferings incurred during the crusade were the will of God and had redemptive value. He delivered the city and his enemies to us, they added, noting that by breaking the strength of the Turks, the devil's power in the world was also weakened. Godfrey and Raymond considered it a blessing from heaven that they were able to subjugate Jerusalem. Their victory was celebrated with mass and an outpouring of prayers. As the crusading movement continued to evolve over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, Urban's theology was constantly revisited and expanded upon, acting as the basis for a developing martial spirituality. William of Tyre, who was born in the Crusader states, established by the victories of 1099, theorized that the success of these Turkish unbelieving enemies could be attributed to the sins of Christians. Agreeing with Urban that in waging war upon the Turks, Crusaders were avenging evils visited upon their brethren and obtaining remission for sins. William even interpreted the entire history of Islam in light of Crusade theology. He described the emergence of the Prophet Muhammad and his militant followers as the beginning of a great catastrophe for the Christians of the East, subjecting them to both political conquest and spiritual error. In preaching the Second Crusade in 1147, Pope Eugenius III also praised the work of Urban, reminding Western Europeans that any who chose to go on crusade could be certain that their families and possessions would be under the protection of the Church, and that any transgression against a crusader was punishable with excommunication. An outstanding example of this protective insurance occurred in 1192, after the Third Crusade, when Richard the Lionheart, while returning from the Holy Land, was captured in Vienna by his political enemy, Emperor Henry VI. Henry's supporters became very nervous about the emperor's mistreatment of the famous crusader, and Pope Celestine III threatened Henry with excommunication until Richard was released. In echoing Urban's description of the crusader as a pilgrim fighting for the remission of sin, Pope Eugenius encouraged an aesthetic simplicity and consciousness in preparations. Those who war for the Lord should by no means prepare themselves with precious garments, nor with provision for their personal appearance, nor with dogs or hawks or other things which pretend licentiousness. Eugenius described the rejection of pomp and shrewd dedication to military effectiveness as a prayerful, virtuous approach in the eyes of God. These notions would be echoed by Bernard of Clairvaux, who insisted that crusaders should arm themselves interiorly with faith and exteriorly with steel rather than decorate themselves with gold. European warriors participating in the Crusades were often praised for austere habits, such as King Louis VII of France, who was said to have held luxury and temporal glory in contempt, and set an example which was better than any sermon. Aesthetic conceptions of the Crusader, which had their origins in Urban's notion of the self-sacrificing Christian knight, helped lead to a unique development of the crusading era that combined the prowess of the medieval warrior with the spirituality of monasticism, the religious military orders. These were communities of fighting monks, established at the opening of the 12th century in the Crusader states, who took vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and a fourth vow to defend Christendom. The poor Knights of Christ in the Temple of Solomon, who would come to be known as the Knights Templar, were established in 1119 by two veterans of the First Crusade, Hugh of Payon and Godfrey of St. Omer, both devoutly religious men dedicated to Crusade spirituality. The Templars quickly became one of the most powerful organizations of the High Middle Ages, for they immediately had an advocate in St. Bernard of Clairvaux, whose writing incorporated them into the theology of the Church. Bernard composed a treatise outlining the theological reasons for the existence of the Templars, contrasting the spiritual state of a Templar to that of a warrior engaging in unjust violence. The sinful aggressor took on a double risk of losing his mortal life in combat, and more importantly, his immortal life, due to his violation of the fifth commandment. But Bernard described a knight of the Temple as utterly free from such a risk, secure that in vanquishing his pagan foe he served the will of God, but also certain that his death was, in fact, a greater glory, for it meant eternal life. Bernard stated that pagans should not be slaughtered when there is any other way to prevent them from harassing and persecuting the faithful, but he asserted that the danger of Islamic domination was too pressing in the East for capable Christians not to act. Bernard noted that to reject violence would only lead to the slaughter and enslavement of Christians, the allowance of which would itself be sinful. In preparing for war, Bernard wrote that the Templars should be discerning, organized, and thoughtful, for a Christian was to be a man of peace, even on the battlefield. But once he was actually engaged in combat, Bernard urged the warrior monks to fall violently upon the foe, regarding them as so many sheep, alleviating any awe he might have felt before the enemy's vast numbers by recalling that he was in God's service and had nothing to fear. Perceiving the hand of God in the recent Crusader triumphs, Bernard described the Templar as waging war against a fleshly foe in addition to a spiritual army of evil. The saint considered this to be more remarkable than the activities of a secular knight, but also felt the Templar's calling to be higher than that of a non-fighting monk. When someone strongly resists a foe in the flesh, relying solely on the strength of the flesh, I would hardly remark it, since this is common enough. And when war is waged by spiritual strength against vices or demons, this too is nothing remarkable, praiseworthy as it is, for the world is full of monks. But when one sees a man powerfully girding himself with both swords and nobly marking his belt, who would not consider it worthy of all wonder, the more so since it has been hitherto unknown? He is truly a fearless knight and secure on every side, for his soul is protected by the armor of faith, just as his body is protected by the armor of steel. He is thus doubly armed and need fear neither demons nor men. Not that he fears death, no, he desires it. Why should he fear to live or fear to die, when for him to live is Christ and to die is gain? Gladly and faithfully he stands for Christ, but he would prefer to be dissolved and to be with Christ. By far the better thing. The Crusades proved to be one of the most powerful and influential movements of the Middle Ages, and though they were certainly driven by the military prowess of the Western European knight, it was their spiritual and theological depth which solidified their endurance. Pope Urban II, by concentrating and articulating pervading 11th century Christian ideas about Jerusalem, pilgrimage, and Muslim expansion, initiated a system of martial spirituality that would inspire centuries of medieval minds, allowing the Church to oversee the defense of Christian civilization in a manner that took full advantage of both the religious piety and combative prowess that pervaded the nobility. Thus did Crusade theology serve the spiritual and temporal needs of the era, representing a pivotal chapter in the evolution of Christian theories about just war. Indeed, the spiritual thinkers of the Crusades made it clear that riding into battle could not only be justified, but could even be an act of great love, self-giving, and prayer.